let's talk a little bit about what kind of book Revelation is. The way we read the book of Revelation and understand it will depend on what kind of book we think it is. And most of the misunderstandings of Revelation, I think, start with misunderstanding what kind of a book it is. And you think about it, every day we're confronted with different kinds of communication. You don't interpret the sports section of the news in the same way that you do the front page headlines. You don't interpret an email from a friend in the same way you would a business letter or business email. You don't interpret a poem from a friend in the same way that you would a historical novel that you're reading. So we're confronted every day with different kinds of literature, and the kind of book or literature or the kind of communication that we're listening to, that affects the way you read it. You don't read everything the same way. And the same is true in the Bible. The Bible's full of different kinds of literature, and Revelation is a rather unique book. And part of the problem is, as we'll see, we really don't have anything close to it. We're familiar with novels, or we're familiar with biographies that kind of help us to read the Gospels. We're familiar with letters, although it's usually in the form of emails. So we're familiar with kind of what's going on with letters, or Paul's letters in the New Testament. But when's the last time you wrote or read something that looked like the book of Revelation? Revelation is a rather unique kind of book, and it requires that we try to understand what kind of book it is before we read it. Revelation actually belongs to three kinds of literature that would have been familiar to the readers in the first century. The first one is what is called an apocalypse. Now, when you hear the word apocalypse, you might think of movies with the title Apocalypse in it or something like that. You might think of a widespread decimation of the world or something like that, or widespread destruction in some movie you're watching. But apocalypse, as the way we use it at least, is a designation for a kind of literature, an apocalypse, that would have been familiar to the first century readers. Now, in the New Testament, Revelation is the only book that we have that could be called an apocalypse. In the Old Testament, the closest book similar to Revelation is the book of Daniel and parts of Ezekiel as well. But an apocalypse was a familiar kind of literature in the first century to the readers, and there were a number of them that are not included in our Bible, in our Old New Testament, that were still circulating during this time that most of the readers have been familiar with. And what an apocalypse is it's a kind of literature that records a vision that someone had. In this case, a vision of John. And what that vision consists of is that vision is meant to uncover or unveil the true nature of reality. It's meant to unveil the true nature of the world that the readers are living in. It's not just a prediction of events that are going to happen down the road sometime, but it's actually meant to reveal the true nature of reality, the true nature of what is going on in the reader's world. So the first century readers, you can read more about them in chapter 2 and 3, the 7 churches that John is addressing. 7 historical churches are living in the context of the first century Roman Empire, an empire that promises peace and security and prosperity to those that fall under its rule, to those that give it allegiance and recognize its importance and kind of bow to its supremacy. But then in this vision, John is actually unveiling the true nature of the Roman Empire and demonstrating what it's really like. Revelation does refer to the future, but even then it's to help them make sense of the present, to show them that this world is not all there is. It's heading somewhere. So that's kind of what Revelation does. It unveils the true nature of reality, but it does so, and this is kind of the unique aspect of an apocalypse. It unveils the true nature of things through images and symbols and metaphors, not literally. So when John describes the first century world, when he describes what's going on in the Roman Empire, when he describes the future, he does so not literally, but he does so through images and symbols, or through metaphors. I mean, you think about it, what would be more effective in thinking in terms of why communicate in symbols and images? Well, it has a more profound impact. I mean, think about it. What would be more impactful for John to say, the Roman Empire is not all it's cracked up to be. It promises peace and prosperity and security, but it's really evil. It means you harm, and it stands for everything that goes against God and His Word and His truth. Or would it be more impactful for John to say, and I saw a seven-headed beast coming up out of the sea, and it had horns, and it breathed fire, and things like that? Which would be more effective? Well, symbols and images have a way of capturing our attention. It has a way of drawing us in and affecting not only our minds, but our emotions as well. And so that's how Revelation, as an apocalypse, that's how it reveals the true nature of reality, of the first century world as well as the future, by using symbols and images that the readers were familiar with that would impact them and help them to see things in a new light. So Revelation is an apocalypse. That is, it's a record of John's vision that he sees that is meant to uncover the true nature of the world, to give the readers a new perspective on the world, and it does so through symbols. So Revelation is apocalypse. It's a record of John's vision meant to uncover the true nature of the world that the readers are living in, to help them to make sense of it so that they can respond appropriately. Second, Revelation is also a prophecy. When we think of prophecy, we usually think of predicting the future. That Revelation is a book that just predicts events in the 21st century. And as we've seen, Revelation does refer to the future, especially chapters 19 through 22, in my view, are all about the future. When God returns, when Christ returns to bring God's purposes to their conclusion, to set up His kingdom on earth, to establish a new creation. But prophecy, especially biblical prophecy, is far more than that. Biblical prophecy is not like looking into a crystal ball and predicting someone's future. It's not like reading someone's palms to tell what's going to happen in the future. Biblical prophecy was meant to both encourage and to warn God's people. It provided a message that was relevant to the original hearers of the book of Revelation. I mean, think about it. In the Old Testament, when did God send prophets to the Israelites, to the people of God? Well, when they were straying from their covenant relationship, when they were going into idolatry, when they were tempted to stray from the Old Testament law, God would send prophets to call them back and to warn them against the dangers of ignoring their covenant relationship with God, the dangers of disobeying, and to encourage them to maintain their faithfulness to that covenant. As a prophecy, Revelation's doing the same thing. To first century readers, again, Revelation 2 and 3, the seven churches in Revelation. To those readers living in the Roman Empire, in a hostile, ungodly empire, and they're struggling to maintain their faithful witness, as a prophecy, Revelation is meant to communicate a message directly relevant to those readers, to call them back to faithfulness to their relationship to Jesus Christ, to warn them of the dangers of straying, to call them to repentance, but also to encourage the churches to their faithful witness, no matter what the consequences it might bring. So Revelation as a prophecy is not mainly about predicting the future. and especially the 21st century. But it's more concerned with communicating a message to those first readers to warn them against the dangers of straying from the relationship of Jesus Christ, of compromising their witness, and to call them back to faithful witness to Jesus Christ, but also to encourage them. The third kind of literature that Revelation belongs to is a letter. We don't often think of this. We get wrapped up with Revelation as a prophecy and an epistle, and we should. But Revelation is also a letter. If you read the book carefully, it begins and ends much like one of Paul's letters that you may be familiar with from the rest of the New Testament. And what's important about that? What's important about the fact that Revelation is a letter? Well, a letter basically in the first century was meant to address the specific needs of its audience. It was meant to address an issue or a crisis or a problem or some kind of issue with the readers. And you look at Paul's letters, for example, the book of Galatians. Why did Paul write the letter to the Galatians? Well, the Galatian Christians in the first century were facing a threat from the Judaizers to conform to the Old Testament law, and in addition to their faith in Jesus Christ, they needed to submit to the Old Testament law. And Paul writes a letter to address that problem. And so what that means is Revelation is meant to, as a letter, to address a specific situation or specific needs of the first century readers. And therefore it must communicate something that would meet those needs, that would address that situation, that the readers could understand. Biblical scholars call this, the letters are occasional. And by that, it doesn't mean they're just written on occasions, but occasional. They were occasioned or they were brought about in response to specific problems. Paul or Peter or John in the New Testament didn't just sit down and write letters for the sake of writing something that would be included in the Bible, but they wrote letters in response to specific problems or issues in the church. And we just saw that with the book of Galatians. The same is true with Revelation. And again, you can find out more about the problems that the churches were facing in chapters 2 and 3. And we'll talk again in another video about what was the situation of the first century church. Why was Revelation written? What problems was it addressing? But that was part of a letter. That was what a letter was used for, to communicate something that would address the needs, the specific needs of the readers. Now, what does this all mean for reading the book of Revelation? How is understanding the kind of literature it is relevant to or important for reading the book of Revelation? As I said, most of the time, misunderstandings of Revelation start with misunderstanding what kind of book it is. So how does understanding that Revelation is an apocalypse, a prophecy, and a letter helpful for reading Revelation? Well, first of all, we won't interpret Revelation literally, but we'll interpret it symbolically or metaphorically. Again, that doesn't mean that Revelation is like a fantasy book or something like that. It still refers to real persons and places and events in the first century and the future, but it describes them metaphorically and symbolically. So we interpret Revelation symbolically. We ask what those symbols and images mean, especially for the first century readers. How do we understand those? We'll talk about that at a later time. But the first principle that comes from the kind of literature it is we interpret Revelation symbolically, not literally. A second one is we need to interpret it in light of its first century setting. That is, we need to interpret it in light of how the first readers would have understood it. Remember, it's a prophecy, it's a letter, it's a message to them. It's meant to address their situation. So a second principle would be, how would the first century readers have understood this? Any interpretation that John could not have intended and his first listeners would never have understood is probably incorrect. So first of all, we need to understand it in light of its first century setting. Another principle for interpreting Revelation that grows out of the kind of literature it is that Revelation is meant to encourage and to warn its readers. It's meant to call God's people to faithfulness to Jesus Christ. It's not primarily meant to predict the future. It's not primarily a book that we can use to try to construct an end time chart that will help us to figure out exactly what's going to happen before Christ returns, and that we can then know how close we are to that. Revelation the kind of book it is not primarily about predicting the future and satisfying our curiosity about what's going to happen. Instead, it's meant to warn and encourage the church. It's meant to call us to obedience. It's meant to call us to faithful witness to Jesus Christ. And any interpretation that doesn't start there and doesn't do that is probably off on the wrong foot to begin with. So those are just some of the principles for interpreting Revelation that kind of grow out of the kind of book it is. So understanding the type of book Revelation is, the type of literature it is, it's an apocalypse, it's a prophecy, it's a letter, and understanding those in light of the first century world that they grew out of and that they belong to is essential for understanding what kind of book Revelation is.